Welcome to the Eminent Domain Podcast with your host, Clint Schumacher of Dawson & Sod LLP. This is the discussion forum for the Eminent Domain community. Join us as we seek insight from industry thought leaders and experts. We'll follow the latest news in the eminent domain world, cases, projects, laws, and policy through the voices of the people who are shaping how we apply the Fifth Amendment.
Welcome to episode 75 of the Eminent Domain Podcast. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for your loyalty and continuing to listen. I'm excited to get to share this podcast with you. We have a great guest, Casey Pipes from Mobile, Alabama. Casey, very well known, very well credentialed, very knowledgeable eminent domain lawyer. And he talks to us about a subject that really I knew very little about, really nothing about, until he and I began to visit about it. And that's the deployment of broadband, particularly to rural areas, but even in urban areas where there is legislative fiat allowing easements used for another purpose, typically electrical easements, to now be expanded to include broadband. So you can hang broadband wires in an easement that didn't allow for that, which is really a pretty clear taking, at least from my viewpoint, but perhaps viewed to be de minimis enough that our legislatures have just pushed it through. But I think it's an issue that deserves attention. And Casey has joined us to talk about that. So with that, let's jump right in. This Clint, I'm going to break into this episode with a request that popped up after the episode had already been recorded and finalized and edited and put together for production. Professor Diane Zahm from Virginia Tech, who reached out to advise about an opening they have on their staff and asked if I knew of anyone that had interest. So I asked her if I could bring this up to the podcast audience, and she was very graciously agreed to do that. They're looking to fill an assistant professor opening at Virginia Tech, and the teaching responsibilities would include land use law, environmental law, critical areas law, and legal foundations of planning. The job is not in the law school, but it would be part of their undergraduate program and also part of their master's program and potentially their doctoral program. It'd also be part of their regional planning curriculum. So I wanted to raise that to anyone that might have interest. I'll put a link to the job opening that Professor Zahm sent to me on the show notes for this episode. And Professor Zahm, thank you for reaching out and thank you for listening to the show. And with that, let's jump right back into the interview with Casey Pipes. Casey Pipes is the managing partner at the Helmsing Leach Law Firm in Mobile, Alabama. Casey primarily represents property owners in condemnation actions across the state of Alabama, and he's a fellow in the American College of Real Estate Lawyers, a member of the Counselors of Real Estate organization, and he's Alabama's member in the Owners Council of America. Casey has been recognized by just about every lawyer ranking group, including Chambers and Partners, and he's received the Best Lawyers Lawyer of the Year recognition in 6 of the past 7 years. Casey's a regular presenter at the National ALI-CLE Eminent Domain and Land Valuation Litigation Seminar, and at the January 2022 conference, the one that's coming up in Scottsdale, Arizona. Casey will be part of a panel discussion on the issue of state legislative initiatives to facilitate rural broadband deployment and the constitutional challenges that are brought about by these bills and laws. And it's this topic that he joins us to talk about here today. So Casey, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining.
Well, thank you, Clint. Thanks for the invitation, for the opportunity to join you here. This will be my first podcast once I finish it, so I'm excited to be trying something new here.
Well, good. Well, you are a very well-spoken man and very extremely knowledgeable and very kind. I think you're going to make a great interview. I think your first podcast experience is going to go well, and I'm honored I get to interview you before anybody else has. So I alluded to this in the introduction. Casey alerted me to an issue that I was really unfamiliar with. I don't know if I had my head in the sand or what, relating to broadband deployment within existing easements that don't allow for broadband, or, and we'll get into this later on in the interview, broadband crossing railroad lines. And so, Casey, maybe let's focus first on private property or non-railroad property and how that's being impacted by some of the broadband statutes that are in place or even being passed. Tell us, if you would, just give us an overview of that issue and what's going on.
Yeah, well, this comes out of an obviously bigger issue of trying to encourage and facilitate the deployment of broadband. And this goes back to the federal programs, the American Recovery Reinvestment Act of 2009, then the American Broadband Initiative in 2019. But these federal initiatives essentially push down a lot of money, $20.4 billion in the FCC's Rural Digital Fund and other billions of dollars in federal money to facilitate broadband companies, private companies, to go deploy this broadband in areas that don't have it. And traditionally that's rural areas or maybe even some suburban areas where it just wasn't cost effective for these companies to stretch the fiber out just to pick up one or two houses or farms or whatever. And so this federal money tried to make that more appealing to the companies. But one part of it also was these companies are trying to get out there in a hurry. They're trying to apply for these grants, get a grant, and go extend and connect these people to fulfill the grant. And they can't seem to move fast enough to get there on their own. And so they have lobbied state legislatures to pass laws that will essentially transform existing utility easements, in most cases electric easements, to essentially statutorily rewrite those to also include broadband. And this is kind of came out of these federal programs or federal ideas of leveraging existing infrastructure assets to help facilitate the prompt, fast, and cheap expansion of broadband. But they went way beyond just using public roads and highways for these broadband corridors to also using private utility easements over private property. But of course, the easement on its own terms may or it may not have allowed for communication lines. But if you assume it didn't allow for it, these laws would essentially rewrite those private easements to allow for it. And it's kind of what I call a piggyback statute, where you've got a broadband company piggybacking on some existing easement. But again, to the point here from a takings analysis, to me, it's no different than the broadband company being given the power just to cross your land with their own easement by statutory decree. Because if this utility easement doesn't provide for that, you can't just expand it to make it do something that it wasn't intended to do originally. And so it's a permanent physical occupation, it's a taking. And from there, it goes into analysis of either what's the remedy or is it unconstitutional.
Casey, in our discussions leading up to our interview today, you sent me a link to a press release that's on Waldo and Lyle's webpage about a lawsuit they've got going on in the Western District of Virginia that our colleague Josh Baker and some of his colleagues there at their law firm are involved in, involving one of these statutes. And I'll put a link to that press release in the show notes so people can get a sense of the issue. But where, obviously now we know what's going on in Virginia because of Josh and them's lawsuit. What other states do we see statutes like this being passed? Or what other places is this an issue?
I'm still trying to figure out exactly who doesn't have one. I would suspect most states have a statute like this, or they will soon have one. But that's not me going around and checking the box on each state on the map right now, Clint. But when we get the paper ready for the January conference, I'll give that to you to post up as well. But the reason it's everywhere or soon to be everywhere is you have to understand who gains from it. Your power companies benefit from these kinds of statutes because they've got a new revenue stream that they can capitalize on. Your broadband and telecommunications companies are in favor of it because it gives them a free right-of-way that allows them to then capitalize on getting more federal free grant money. And it's a pretty popular thing for a lot of state legislators to support rural broadband. So, you've got some pretty powerful people that are in favor of it. And then you look to the other side of who's organized to speak against it. Probably not much. So, I think these things get passed pretty quickly, pretty readily across party aisles in most state legislatures.
Well, and I can certainly see that. If you just look at it at a surface level, I think it's easy to say, okay, well, if you hang one more string on the pole, who's really being damaged by that? But of course, we as property owners, lawyers know, hey, that is a stick in the bundle of sticks. And if I haven't sold that to you, that's a right that I have. And if you're going to just allow free passage without payment, that is in essence the very definition of a taking of a property right. So it's a very interesting issue to me. And I know you've got even some more particular expertise within this very subset of specialization, and that is in the crossing of railroad property. So maybe tell us a little bit about what's going on in that arena.
Yeah, one of the federal programs to push out broadband, or one of the federal agencies, is the FCC. And the FCC is limited and prohibited under its Federal Communications Act from interfering with or regulating the crossing of railroads. And so it can't directly do anything, I don't think, towards this issue of how does a broadband company cross a railroad. But they've still identified the railroad industry as some form of barrier or obstacle to the deployment of broadband worthy of the FCC's attention. And so they created back in 2017 what they called the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. And this committee came up with a state model code because they couldn't do it at a federal level, but a state model code. And in that model code, Article 5 deals with how to cross railroads. And this is sort of a suggested code for the various states to adopt that would allow crossings of railroads by broadband, was the whole point, but it soon mushrooms into just about everybody under the authority of this to be passed state law. And it would allow for a permanent physical occupation on railroad property, whether it's owned in fee or whether it's just a railroad easement or whatever it may be, permanent occupation for a set fee, statutorily set, with quick turnaround shot clocks for approval, where if you don't approve it within a certain time or object within a certain time, it's deemed approved. And it just lets them kind of blow and go, whether they're going overhead or underground. They pick the method and they just roll it out. And the fee limits are modest. I think it was in the state model code, $500, but in various states that have adopted something along the lines of the model code, it's $1,000 or something like that. But to review the engineering, to get the flag men to be there during the construction, to do all the other work that it takes, I don't think anybody would think that it can be done for less than the amount of money that's allowed to be charged. And that ignores the difference in the property value caused by this additional burden or this crossing, whatever the facilities are. So that's a law that's also going around. It does not, obviously it's not really the power companies that care about this law. So it's only the communication companies that do. And it's not everybody's property that's impacted by it. It's only the railroad's property, but the railroads are a critical part of our national infrastructure as well. And so this law has kind of gotten a little less attention, I would say, and it's probably less widely adopted as well, Clint.
Casey, other than railroad companies, what other types of industries or clients or types of properties even might be particularly impacted by these broadband issues? Where do we need to be paying particular attention?
Well, it's sort of a narrow view. Clearly, if you're a property owner, particularly a large property owner that has an electric transmission line running through it, you might be, instead of a fiber optic company coming to you to get an easement, you might be giving up that easement for free. And I think that's kind of what the situation in the Virginia lawsuit that you referenced earlier, where a fiber company was negotiating for an easement, and then instead of paying the landowner for the easement, they just piggyback under the Virginia statute. Obviously, at a narrow view, the railroads would be exposed to this issue, and they're obviously aware of it. But in a broader view, it's really everybody. You've got this, and it's not the first time we've had something like this happen in the country, but you've got this technology, and there's a legitimate reason. I'm sure that everybody would agree that it would be good to have broadband for people, whether they live in the city or live in the suburbs or live in the rural areas. But you can't just expand an easement to make it say something it doesn't say. What if instead of expanding electric easements to allow for broadband, the legislature said we're going to expand electric easements to allow for public roads? Did you agree to let a public road go through your property? Or did you agree to let an electric transmission line come through your property? And no one would think ALDOT, the Alabama Department of Transportation, where I am, or your state DOT could just piggyback on an electric easement to build a highway. So if the state doesn't have the power to do it themselves, where do you think they get the power to give it to a broadband company? A for-profit entity that's providing a public purpose maybe, but it's certainly not even as public as the state highway department. And so it's just kind of this weird world where you're changing property rights at the state capitol to allow for overburdening of an easement, or in the context of these crossings, to just let somebody cross you. And while most of the listeners to your podcast, Clint, probably don't own a railroad, what if the same crossing, what if the focus of this state model code expanded beyond railroads to cover interstate natural gas pipelines, to allow for crossings of farm property, to allow for crossings of property with a federal mortgage on it? Whatever it is, it's an erosion of constitutional property rights to think that you can just take it away by only focusing on the good or the public purpose behind this use. And, I think that's where these permanent physical occupations receive different treatment in the court system. They are undeniably a taking. And when challenged, particularly in the railroad context, when these laws have been challenged as being unconstitutional, the way they've been saved in the court opinions that have not declared them to be unconstitutional is to say, well, the railroad still has their inverse condemnation rights. They're not limited by these fees in the statute. They can just sue for inverse condemnation. And because there's a clear path to being compensated there, the statute's not unconstitutional. But the problem I've seen with some of these statutes is that doesn't necessarily work when some of the beneficiaries of these state laws don't have the power of eminent domain. They're not PSC regulated utilities. They're not telecommunications companies in the way that term is defined in a lot of state laws giving condemnation power. So what's your remedy when somebody like that crosses you? You don't have an inverse condemnation remedy. You don't have a clear path to compensation, and you've got another whole problem on your hands. And I think it's just kind of indicative of the whole issue is that you've got some entities without the power of eminent domain that are benefiting from these laws where you'd think the remedy is an inverse claim, but it may not be. Not for every one of the potential users of these state laws. And so I think from, back to your question of who should care about this, you'd think a lot of people would, even if this immediate issue doesn't seem to take food off your plate today. It should concern a lot of people and, a lot of the listeners to your podcast a great deal.
Casey, that's a point well made. And I appreciate you bringing this to my attention and now our audience's attention. You referenced in one of your earlier answers the railroad crossing memorandum that the FCC had prepared. I will put you're kind enough to send that to me, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes, along with the Waldo and Lyle article and some other articles that you had sent me that discuss the issue in further detail. And then, of course, I'm really looking forward to listening to your presentation and your panel discussion at the 2022 conference on this issue. And we'll update the show notes with whatever other materials you're able to put together between now and then. But Casey, thank you for visiting with us about that.
Yeah, and just to make clear, I'm not doing that one on my own. I've got Brian Coons from the Waldo and Lyle firm and Bob McNamara from the Institute of Justice also on the panel for the January 2022 Scottsdale conference. So I'm looking forward to that as well.
It'll be a great panel. Well, Casey, one of the best parts of the show, or I should say one of the listeners' favorite parts of the show, is our cross-examination segment, which is a series of fun questions that are designed to let our listeners get to know you a little bit better. Do you mind playing along?
I'd love to.
All right. Casey and I offline talked quite a bit about SEC football. And of course, anybody from Alabama, I've learned there's an initial question, which is, are you an Alabama fan or Auburn fan? I won't spoil the suspense for everybody else, Casey, but declare your allegiance.
Roll Tide.
All right. Now, do you have any book or podcast recommendation for our listeners?
I kind of fall in and out of listening to a lot of podcasts. One that I really like and recommended to some other people, and they either think I'm weird or they loved it, is something called The End of the World with Josh Clark. It was kind of a I don't know how many different ways that you could have a human ending event on Earth. And it kind of made you think. It put some things into perspective, and it was done well before the COVID pandemic, but there's actually an episode on a virus. But it's worth a listen. You'll either think I'm weird or you'll love it if you're like most other people. But I enjoyed it.
I have not heard of that one before. Casey, that's interesting. Now, sometimes I'll listen to podcasts kind of right as I'm dozing off to sleep to wind down, but that doesn't sound like one you'd want to listen to as you're trying to go to bed.
No, and it's really not one that I would recommend you binge listen to. I mean, I would give each episode its due and let that settle into your old brain before you keep pushing through. Otherwise, you'll certainly have some nightmares, I think.
Interesting. All right. Well, if you could bring back any fashion trend, what would it be?
Oh, that's easy. It's easy. And when you see me in Scottsdale, you'll know I'd bring back hats. I mean, I'm bald and I will sunburn my brain if you give me a chance to stand out in the sun. And so I would bring back hats for men at all events and occasions. That'd be my fashion trend.
Now, you talking about fedoras? What kind of hat are we talking about?
Any kind of hat. I'm not picky, but I just make it more. If everybody else was wearing them, I wouldn't look so out of place wearing mine.
There you go. Well, I didn't give you a preview of this question, but I wanted to ask it anyway. I got to thinking about it. When coming to Mobile, Alabama, where is the best place to eat?
Well, we do pretty well on barbecue, but most people that come to town want to try some seafood. We've got great seafood off the Gulf of Mexico and in Mobile Bay, and there are just any number of places that are good. But if you were coming into town, you and I'd go to the Bluegill on the Causeway, Clint, and it's got a nice deck that overlooks the Mobile River Delta, and you can get just about anything you want there.
Oh, my goodness. Well, Casey, I'm going to have to find an excuse to make that happen. You got me sold.
Well, I keep suggesting Mobile is the venue for this ALI-CLE conference, but they haven't taken me up on it yet.
Well, there's always next year.
That's what I keep saying.
All right. Well, here's the final one. If you could post a message on a billboard for 30 days, Casey, what would it be?
It's funny. It's hard to even pay attention to all the billboards that are around, but the one that gets me, I guess, more annoyed than most are all the lawyer advertisements on them. I think my billboard would say, "Don't hire a lawyer on a billboard." But, that's just me being petty. But, I think hiring a lawyer is a very important decision, and you really need to do some due diligence and homework on it. And the fact that so many people are hiring lawyers just off billboards and whatnot, that gets under my skin a little bit more than it probably should. But I think I'd do that. And maybe that would discourage somebody from releasing that billboard the next month for an attorney ad.
Well, that seems good to me. I have a cousin who, because I am not on a billboard or the side of a bus or on a park bench, is convinced I'm not a real lawyer. So that would be helpful to me just from a familial relation standpoint. Well, Casey, what's the best way for our lawyers to follow up with you or find you or get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, first, I'd love to see everybody in Scottsdale in January. I'm hoping we get a good crowd out there. I'm looking forward to being back at a conference and, a live one. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't have a whole lot of other social presence, but the good news is if you just Google Casey in Alabama or Casey in eminent domain, because of it's a fairly unique name, you'll find me on the internet, find my website, firm website, or the OCA website, or some other website I've found my way to, but I'm fairly easy to find.
Well, Casey, I sure did enjoy getting to visit with you. I enjoyed our interview. I enjoyed our interactions leading up to the interview. And like you, I hope we get to see each other in person in Scottsdale here in a few months.
That sounds great, Clint. And again, appreciate the opportunity to do this. This was great. This was fun.
In the closing argument today, many thanks to Casey Pipes for joining the podcast. Casey, it was great to get to visit with you. Thank you for sharing that information and issues in the broadband community with us. If you have an idea for a guest or know about a case or issue that should be discussed, please let me know. My contact information is on our website at www.eminentdomainpodcast.com. If you get a few minutes, please leave a review on iTunes. It helps us get the word out about the show, and we would appreciate your feedback. As always, we will release episodes around the first of the month. In the middle of the month, we hope that you will join us, and thank you for joining us yet again. Until next time, I leave you with the words of Winston Churchill. All the great things are simple, and many can be expressed in a single word: freedom, justice, honor, duty, mercy, hope.
Thank you for joining us on the Eminent Domain Podcast. The materials in this podcast are made available by Dawson & Sod LLP for informational purposes only and do not constitute legal advice. The transmission and receipt of information contained in this product do not form or constitute an attorney-client relationship. The transmission of an email request for information does not create an attorney-client relationship, and you should not send us via email any confidential information or facts relating to your legal problems or questions unless we are first formally engaged as your counsel. Anyone receiving any part of the information in this podcast should not act upon the information without seeking professional legal counsel. Views and opinions of guests of this podcast may not constitute the views and opinions of the host or of Dawson & Sod LLP.